The crack echoed across the prairie like a gunshot, and Theresa Sullivan felt her heart drop as the wagon lurched violently to one side. She pulled hard on the reins, her knuckles white as the horses whinnied in confusion, and when the dust settled around her, she saw what she had feared most. The rear wheel had shattered completely. Splintered wood scattered across the rough trail like broken bones. She sat there for a long moment, alone under the vast Nebraska sky, with nothing but golden grass stretching endlessly in every direction, and the sun already climbing toward its afternoon peak. It was June of 1878, and Theresa had been traveling for 3 weeks from her family's homestead in eastern Nebraska, heading west toward the small ranch she had inherited from her uncle near the Wyoming border. At 22 years old, she had thought herself capable of making the journey alone, stubborn pride preventing her from accepting the offers of escort from neighboring families. Now, staring at the ruined wheel, that pride felt foolish. The nearest town was Lincoln, which she had passed 2 days ago, and the settlement she was aiming for was still at least 4 days ahead, maybe more. She climbed down from the wagon seat, her brown traveling dress dusty and worn, and knelt beside the shattered wheel to assess the damage. The hub had cracked straight through, and several spokes had snapped like kindling. There was no repairing this, not with what little she had in the wagon. Theresa stood slowly, shading her eyes against the bright sun, and looked in every direction. Nothing but grass and sky and the rutted trail that stretched like a scar across the landscape. Her water supply would last perhaps 2 more days if she rationed carefully. Her food stores were adequate, but would not help if she could not move forward. The horses stamped nervously, sensing her distress. She was considering unhitching one of the horses and riding for help when she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east, back the way she had come. Theresa turned, one hand instinctively moving to the small pistol she kept tucked in her belt. A lone rider could mean help or could mean danger, and out here on the open prairie, there was no way to know until it was too late to run. The figure emerged from the heat shimmer, riding at an easy canter on a paint horse that moved with the fluid grace of an animal well-trained and well-loved. As he drew closer, Theresa could make out details. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from the relentless sun. A coil of rope hung from his saddle, and she could see the worn handle of a revolver at his hip. He slowed as he approached, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. "Afternoon, madam," he called out when he was still a respectful distance away. "Looks like you have run into some trouble." His voice was deep and calm, carrying easily across the space between them. Theresa relaxed slightly but kept her guard up. "My wheel shattered," she said, gesturing to the wreckage. "I am stranded." The cowboy dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. He was tall, she noticed, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build that came from hard physical work. As he approached and removed his hat, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, probably around 25 or 26 years old, with dark hair and gray eyes that held a directness she found oddly reassuring. "Xavier Reeves," he said, introducing himself with a slight nod. "I have a small ranch about 15 miles northeast of here. Was heading back from selling some horses in Lincoln." He knelt beside the broken wheel, running his hands over the damage with the careful assessment of someone who understood machinery and wood. "This is bad," he said after a moment, looking up at her. "The hub is cracked clean through. You will not be going anywhere on this wheel." "I know," Theresa said, hearing the frustration in her own voice. "I just do not know what to do about it." Xavier stood, brushing dust from his hands. Where were you headed? West, toward the Wyoming border. My uncle left me a ranch there. He passed last winter, and I am going to take it over. She did not mention that she had no other family, that this ranch represented her only real chance at independence and security. Some things were too personal to share with strangers. He nodded slowly, his eyes moving from her face to the wagon and back again. She could see him thinking, weighing options. I have tools back at my place, he said finally. Wood supplies. I could fashion you a new wheel, but it would take time, most of a day at least. And I would need to bring the wagon back to my ranch to do it proper. How would we get the wagon there? Theresa asked, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. I could ride back, bring a team and a sturdy axle jack. We could support the wagon enough to move it slow. It would take most of the afternoon, but we could get it done before dark if we move quick. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. You are welcome to wait at my ranch while I do the repairs. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who lives in the small cabin out back. She would be proper company for you. Theresa studied him, trying to read his intentions. She had heard too many stories of women alone on the frontier being taken advantage of, but she had also learned to trust her instincts about people. Xavier Reeves looked her directly in the eye when he spoke, his posture open and unthreatening. More importantly, he had mentioned his housekeeper without her having to ask about propriety, which suggested he understood the delicacy of the situation. Why would you help me? She asked bluntly. You do not know me. A slight smile touched his lips, the first real expression she had seen from him. Out here, madam, we help each other when we can. That is how people survive. Besides, he added, his tone becoming more serious, I would not feel right leaving a woman stranded on the prairie. Not with night coming and storms brewing. Theresa glanced at the sky. It was still bright and clear, but she knew weather could change quickly on the plains. She also knew she had few options. All right, she said, making her decision. I would be grateful for your help, Mr. Reeves. Just Xavier, please. He settled his hat back on his head. Let me help you get your most important belongings secured on the wagon, then I will ride back for the equipment. Should not take more than 2 hours. They worked together in practical silence, Theresa directing him to the trunks and supplies that needed the most careful handling. She noticed the way he moved, efficient and strong but careful not to jostle her belongings unnecessarily. When everything was secured, he swung back up onto his paint horse with easy grace. Will you be all right here for a couple hours? He asked, looking down at her with what seemed like genuine concern. I have been alone for 3 weeks, Theresa said with more confidence than she felt. I can manage a few more hours. He nodded and turned his horse back toward the east. Theresa watched him ride away, the distance swallowing him gradually until he was just a dark speck against the golden grass, and then nothing at all. She sat in the shade of her broken wagon and waited, hoping her trust had not been misplaced. True to his word, Xavier returned just over 2 hours later with a sturdy team of draft horses pulling a wagon bed rigged with an impressive array of tools and equipment. He also brought a canteen of fresh water, which he offered to her immediately. Thought you might be getting thirsty, he said. Theresa accepted gratefully, the cool water tasting better than anything she could remember. Together, they worked to jack up her wagon and support the broken corner with a temporary brace that would allow it to be towed slowly. The work was hard and hot, and Theresa insisted on helping despite Xavier's initial protests that she should rest. I am not some delicate flower, she said firmly, grabbing one end of a heavy beam. I can work. She caught that slight smile again. Never said you were, madam, just trying to be polite. Theresa, she said, matching his earlier informality. Just Theresa. All right then, Theresa. If you are determined to help, I could use someone to steady this support while I secure the bolts. They worked well together, she discovered. Xavier gave clear instructions without being condescending, and he seemed to respect her competence when she demonstrated it. By the time they had the wagon secured and ready to tow, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold. The journey to Xavier's ranch was slow and careful, the damaged wagon groaning with every rut in the trail. Theresa rode one of her horses while Xavier managed both teams, his attention constantly on the precarious load. They did not talk much during the journey, both focused on the work at hand, but Theresa found the silence companionable rather than awkward. As the sun touched the horizon, they crested a low rise, and Theresa saw Xavier's ranch spread out in a shallow valley below. It was modest but well-maintained, a sturdy wooden house with a covered porch, a large barn, several corrals with good fencing, and a smaller cabin set back among a cluster of cottonwood trees. Smoke rose from the chimney of the small cabin, and as they approached, an older Chinese woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Xavier," she called out, her English accented but clear. "You bring company." "Emergency assistance, Mrs. Chen," Xavier called back. "This is Miss Theresa Sullivan. Her wagon broke down on the trail. She will be staying in the guest room while I repair her wheel. Could you prepare something for supper? We have both had a long day." Mrs. Chen's weathered face broke into a warm smile. Of course. "Miss Sullivan, you come with me. Get you cleaned up, get you fed. Men can handle the wagon." Theresa glanced at Xavier, who nodded encouragingly. "Go on. You have earned a rest. I will get your things brought to the house once I have the wagon secured." The guest room in Xavier's house was simple but clean, with a comfortable bed, a washstand with a basin and pitcher of water, and a window that looked out over the corrals and the prairie beyond. Theresa washed the dust from her face and hands, changed into a cleaner dress, and joined Mrs. Chen in the kitchen. "You travel alone?" Mrs. Chen asked as she worked at the stove, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "That very brave or foolish," Theresa said with a rueful smile. "I am not sure which yet." Mrs. Chen laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. "Maybe both." "Usually both, I think. Mr. Xavier, he was same when he come here 5 years ago. Young man, barely 20, with big dreams and small money. Now look, he has good ranch, good reputation. Hard work and brave foolishness, that is how things get done out here. How long have you worked for him?" Theresa asked, helping to set the table. 3 years. My husband and we came to Nebraska from California looking for new start. My husband, he gets sick, die first winter. Mr. Xavier, he find me in Lincoln, starving, too proud to beg. He offer me job, fair wage, good cabin. He is good man, Miss Sullivan. You can trust him. The simple declaration, delivered with absolute certainty, warmed Theresa more than she expected. When Xavier came in a short time later, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt, they sat down to a meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and strong coffee. The conversation flowed easily, touching on safe topics like the weather, the quality of grazing land, and the growth of Lincoln. "The railroad has changed everything," Xavier said, soaking bread in his stew. "When I first came out here, Lincoln was barely more than a collection of buildings. Now it is becoming a real city. Brings opportunities but also complications." "What kind of complications?" Theresa asked. "More people means more competition for land and water. More strangers passing through means more uncertainty about who you can trust. The old ways of doing things, where everyone knew everyone and a handshake was as good as a contract, those are fading." He took a sip of coffee. Not saying it is all bad, just different. Have to adapt or get left behind. After dinner, as the darkness settled fully over the prairie and the oil lamps cast warm circles of light, Xavier walked Theresa to the porch. The night air was cool and pleasant after the heat of the day, and the sky was a vast dome of stars, more than she had ever seen even after 3 weeks of traveling. "I will start on your wheel first thing in the morning," Xavier said, leaning against the porch rail. "If all goes well, you should be able to continue your journey the day after tomorrow." "I cannot tell you how grateful I am," Theresa said sincerely. "When that wheel broke, I honestly did not know what I was going to do." "You would have figured something out," Xavier said, and she could hear the confidence in his voice. "You have that look about you, if you do not mind me saying, the look of someone who does not give up easy." "My father used to say I was stubborn as a Missouri mule," Theresa admitted with a smile. "It drove my mother to distraction. Stubborn can be a virtue out here. The prairie does not have much use for people who quit at the first sign of trouble." He paused, and in the lamplight from the window, she could see him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "This ranch you are going to, you planning to run it yourself?" "That is the plan. My uncle had a foreman who stayed on after his passing, or so the lawyer's letter said. I am hoping he is still there and willing to work for a woman owner. And if he is not," Theresa lifted her chin, "then I will find someone who is, or I will learn to do it myself." Xavier nodded slowly. "That stubborn mule determination. Yes, I can see it." But he smiled as he said it, taking any sting from the words. "If you need any advice or help once you get settled, my ranch is not so far away. Maybe a day's ride, depending on exactly where your property is." "I will keep that in mind," Theresa said, and realized she meant it. The idea of having a friendly neighbor, someone she could call on if needed, was more comforting than she wanted to admit. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the darkness and the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that seemed to emphasize the vastness of the land around them. "I should let you get some rest," Xavier said finally. "Tomorrow will be a full day." Theresa slept better that night than she had since beginning her journey. The combination of exhaustion and the security of solid walls around her pulling her into deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the sound of hammering and emerged from the house to find Xavier already hard at work in the barn, the damaged wheel propped up on his workbench. He had stripped away the broken spokes and was carefully measuring and cutting new ones from seasoned oak. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and there was a look of intense concentration on his face. "Morning," Theresa called from the barn doorway. "How long have you been working?" Xavier looked up, pushing hair back from his forehead. "Couple hours." "Wanted to get an early start. Mrs. Chen has breakfast ready in the house if you are hungry." Over the course of that day, Theresa found herself drawn repeatedly to the barn, watching Xavier work. There was something mesmerizing about the way he handled the tools, the careful precision of each cut and measurement. He explained what he was doing as he worked, his deep voice patient as he described the importance of getting the angles exactly right, of ensuring the wood was properly seasoned so it would not crack under stress. "My father was a wheelwright back in Ohio," he told her, carefully fitting a spoke into the hub. "Taught me the trade before I decided ranching was more to my liking. Never thought the skill would come in so handy out here." "You seem to have a lot of skills," Theresa observed. "Ranching, woodworking, what else?" "Enough to get by," Xavier said with characteristic modesty. "Can shoe a horse, birth a calf, shoot well enough to keep the predators from my livestock. Can cook if I have to, though Mrs. Chen is far better at it. Can read and write and cipher, which my mother made sure of even when my father thought it was a waste of time for a boy who would work with his hands. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Died when I was 15. My father followed her 2 years later. That is when I decided to head west, see what opportunities were out here. He paused in his work, looking at her directly. What about your family? You said you were heading to your uncle's ranch, but you have not mentioned anyone else. Theresa sat on a hay bale, watching him work as she spoke. My parents died in a fire when I was 18. House fire, middle of winter. They got me out, but they did not make it out themselves. Even after 4 years, the memory was painful. I lived with my mother's sister in Lincoln after that, helped her with her boarding house. She meant well, but she had very specific ideas about what I should do with my life. Marry a nice shopkeeper, have children, live a respectable conventional life. Not for you, I take it. I tried, I really did. There was a man, a banker's son. We courted for almost a year. He was nice enough, but he wanted a wife who would stay home and host dinner parties and never have an opinion about anything important. When I suggested I might want to keep working, might want to have some independence, he laughed. Actually laughed, like it was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. Xavier's hands stilled on his work. So you ended it? I did. My aunt was furious, said I was throwing away my best chance at security, but I would rather have uncertainty and freedom than security and suffocation. She looked down at her hands. When the lawyer's letter came about my uncle's ranch, my aunt said it was foolishness to even consider going. Said a woman could not possibly run a ranch alone. That just made me more determined to try. Spite can be a powerful motivator, Xavier said, and she could hear the amusement in his voice. It is not spite, Theresa protested, then reconsidered. Well, not just spite. I genuinely want to make a go of it. I want to build something that is mine, something I can be proud of. That I understand, Xavier said, returning to his careful work. That is why I came out here in the first place. Back in Ohio, I could have apprenticed with my father, eventually taken over his business. But it would always have been his business, his legacy. Out here, what I build is mine. They talked throughout the day, conversation flowing easily as Xavier worked, and Theresa helped where she could, handing him tools or holding pieces steady while he worked. She learned that he had started his ranch with just 20 head of cattle and 2 horses, living in a dugout for the first year while he saved enough to build the house. He had slowly expanded, buying more land when he could, building his herd through careful breeding and shrewd trading. It has not been easy, he admitted as he carefully fitted the iron rim around the newly assembled wheel. Had a bad winter in '76 that killed half my herd. Took me a year to recover from that, and there is always something, drought or disease or predators. But every year gets a little easier, a little more stable. Do you ever regret it, coming out here taking the risk? Xavier paused, considering the question seriously. Sometimes on the hard days. When I am out in a blizzard trying to save frozen cattle, or when I have to put down a horse with a broken leg, or when the loneliness gets heavy. But then I look around at what I have built, and I remember why I came. The freedom to make my own choices, to succeed or fail on my own merits. That is worth the hard days. As the sun began to set on that second day, Xavier stepped back from the workbench with a satisfied nod. There, that should do it. I will mount it on the wagon in the morning, and you should be good to continue your journey. Theresa felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that she would be able to continue, but something else too, a reluctance she did not want to examine too closely. Over dinner that evening, Mrs. Chen was full of stories about life in California and the journey to Nebraska, and Xavier contributed his own tales of the early days on his ranch. Theresa found herself laughing more than she had in months. the warmth and companionship soothing something in her soul that had been cold and lonely for far too long. Later, on the porch again under the stars, Xavier said quietly, "You know, that offer of help was genuine. If you get to your uncle's ranch and find yourself in over your head, you can get word to me. I will help if I can." "Why?" Theresa asked, turning to look at him. "Why are you being so kind to a stranger?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe because you are not entirely a stranger anymore. Maybe because I see something of myself in you, that determination to make your own way regardless of what anyone else thinks. Or maybe," and here his voice softened, "because kindness is too rare a thing out here, and I figure the more we show each other, the better chance we all have." Theresa felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. "Xavier Reeves, you are not what I expected when I saw a lone cowboy riding toward my broken wagon." "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone harder, maybe, less thoughtful." "You have surprised me." "Good surprises or bad?" "Very good," Theresa said softly. The next morning came too quickly. Xavier mounted the repaired wheel on the wagon while Theresa and Mrs. Chen packed food supplies for the continuation of her journey. The older woman pressed a bundle of fresh bread and dried meat into Theresa's hands. "You take care of yourself," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "And you remember, you have friends here now. You need anything, you send word." Xavier helped Theresa hitch up her horses, checking every strap and buckle twice to ensure everything was secure. As she climbed up onto the wagon seat, he stood beside the wheel, one hand resting on the sideboard, looking up at her. "Theresa," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice did strange things to her heart. "Would you mind if I rode along with you, at least for today, just to make sure the wheel holds up and you do not run into any more trouble?" She knew she should say no, should maintain the independence she had been so determined to prove, but she found herself nodding instead. "I would like that." Xavier saddled his paint horse and they set out, heading west across the prairie. The repaired wheel rolled smoothly, Xavier's craftsmanship evident in every revolution. They traveled at a comfortable pace, not rushing, and Theresa found herself acutely aware of him riding beside the wagon, close enough that they could talk easily. "Tell me about your uncle," Xavier said after they had been traveling for an hour. "What kind of man was he?" "Honestly, I barely knew him. He was my father's brother, but they had some kind of falling out before I was born. I only met him once that I can remember when I was very small. But he never married, had no children, and I was his only living relative. So he left me the ranch." She paused, then added, "Part of me wonders what I will find when I get there. If the place even still exists, if the foreman is honest, or if he has been stealing my uncle blind." "Those are legitimate concerns," Xavier acknowledged. "You have the deed and papers, locked in a strongbox in the back of the wagon. Good. When you arrive, you establish your ownership right away, make it clear to the foreman and any hands that you are in charge. If any of them give you trouble or seem dishonest, let them go immediately. Better to start fresh than try to work with people you cannot trust." Spoken from experience. I had a hand my first year who was stealing from me, selling my cattle on the side and pocketing the money. Took me 3 months to figure it out. When I finally had proof and confronted him, he tried to pull a gun on me. Xavier's voice was matter of fact, but Theresa heard the edge underneath. "I was faster, did not kill him, but I put a bullet through his shoulder. He rode out of Nebraska and, as far as I know, never came back." "Were you scared?" "Terrified. I was 20 years old and shaking so hard after he rode away that I could barely stand. But I learned an important lesson that day about trusting my instincts and standing up for what is mine." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat some of the food Mrs. Chen had packed. Sitting in the shade of the wagon, sharing bread and dried beef, Theresa felt a contentment she had not experienced in years. Xavier told her about the different grasses and plants they were passing, which ones were good for grazing and which ones signaled water nearby. He pointed out the tracks of various animals, reading the story of the prairie like it was written in a language only he could understand. "You love it out here," Theresa observed. "I can hear it in your voice when you talk about the land." "I do," Xavier admitted. "There is something about the openness, the way you can see for miles in every direction. It makes me feel free in a way I never felt back east, where everything was crowded and closed in." As the afternoon wore on, they crossed into rougher terrain, low hills and rocky outcrops breaking up the endless grass. Xavier rode closer to the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. When Theresa asked him about it, he said simply, "This is good ambush country. Probably nothing to worry about, but it pays to be cautious." Sure enough, as they rounded a hill, they encountered a small group of travelers coming from the opposite direction. A family in a covered wagon much like Theresa's with two men on horseback riding escort. They stopped to exchange news and information, the kind of interaction that was common on the trails where people were starved for word from the outside world. The family was heading to Lincoln, hoping to settle and open a mercantile. The father, a thin man with a worried face, asked Xavier about conditions in the area, about land prices and the temperament of the local population. "Lincoln is growing fast," Xavier told him. "Plenty of opportunity for someone with goods to sell, especially if you are fair in your prices and honest in your dealings. The people out here do not have much patience for cheaters, but they are loyal to merchants they can trust." The family thanked him and continued on their way. As Theresa and Xavier resumed their journey, she said, "You gave him good advice. Do you do that often, help newcomers?" "When I can. Someone helped me when I first arrived, old rancher named Tom Whitmore, who has since passed. He taught me about raising cattle in this climate, about where to find water and how to read the weather. Figure I owe it to his memory to pass that knowledge on when I get the chance." The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, when Xavier pulled his horse to a stop and gestured toward a cluster of cottonwood trees in the distance. "There is a creek over there, good camping spot. We should stop for the night." Theresa had been about to protest that there were still a few hours of daylight left, but something in Xavier's tone stopped her. She followed his gaze and saw what he had already noticed, dark clouds building on the western horizon. "Storm coming?" she asked. "Looks like it. Better to make camp now while we can set up properly than try to rush ahead and get caught in the open." They made camp under the cottonwoods, the creek providing fresh water for the horses and themselves. Xavier showed Theresa how to set up a proper windbreak using her wagon and some canvas, explaining that prairie storms could come up fast and fierce. As he worked, she started a fire and began preparing a simple meal of beans and bacon. The storm hit just after dark, wind and rain lashing at their camp with sudden fury. But Xavier's preparations held, the windbreak diverting the worst of the weather while they huddled close to the fire under a canvas canopy. Thunder rolled across the prairie like artillery, and lightning illuminated the darkness in brilliant flashes. "Does this frighten you?" Xavier asked, sitting close beside her as the storm raged around them. "A little," Theresa admitted, "but less than it would if I were alone." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm, and Theresa found herself intensely aware of Xavier's presence beside her. The warmth of his body in the cool air brought by the rain, the solid strength he represented. When a particularly loud crack of thunder made her jump, he put an arm around her shoulders, a gesture of comfort that felt entirely natural. "It is all right," he said quietly. "The storm will pass. They always do." Theresa leaned into him just slightly and felt his arm tighten in response. They stayed that way for a long time, watching the fire and listening to the rain, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of connection that went beyond mere circumstance. The storm did pass, as Xavier had predicted, rolling away to the east and leaving the air clean and cool in its wake. As they prepared to settle in for the night, Xavier insisting that Theresa take the shelter of the wagon bed while he rolled up in his blanket by the fire, she touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For fixing my wheel, for riding with me today, for making me feel safe in the storm." Xavier looked at her for a long moment, and in the firelight she could see something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Theresa, I need to tell you something." "What?" He seemed to struggle with the words, then said simply, "When I leave you tomorrow, when you continue on to your uncle's ranch and I head back to mine, I am going to miss you. I have known you for barely 3 days, but I am going to miss you." Theresa felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unbidden. "I will miss you too," she whispered. They stood there in the darkness, the space between them charged with possibility, and Theresa thought he might kiss her. But instead Xavier stepped back, his expression conflicted. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice rough. "We have another long day tomorrow." Theresa nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and climbed into the wagon bed. But she lay awake for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of Xavier moving around the camp, her mind racing with thoughts she was not ready to examine. Morning came bright and clear, the storm having washed the world clean. They broke camp efficiently, working together with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms. As they traveled that day, the conversation was lighter, more careful, both of them seeming to step back from the intensity of the previous night. But as the sun climbed toward its peak, Xavier suddenly reined in his horse, his body going tense. Theresa pulled the wagon to a stop, following his gaze to where a thin column of smoke rose in the distance. "That is coming from the direction of the Hendricks place," Xavier said, his voice tight. "Small ranch about 5 miles from here. That much smoke, something is seriously wrong." Without waiting for a response, he spurred his horse into a gallop, heading toward the smoke. Theresa snapped the reins, urging her team to follow as fast as the wagon could manage. By the time she arrived at the small ranch, Xavier had already dismounted and was helping an older couple drag furniture and belongings from a house that was engulfed in flames. Theresa jumped down and ran to help, grabbing blankets and clothing that the couple was frantically trying to save. The heat from the fire was intense, the roar of the flames deafening. Xavier organized them quickly, creating a bucket line from the well to wet down the barn and other outbuildings to keep the fire from spreading. They worked for hours, until the house was nothing but smoldering ruins and they were all exhausted and covered in soot. The older couple, whom Xavier introduced as Bill and Martha Hendricks, sat on salvaged chairs in their yard and stared at the destruction of their home. "How did it start?" Xavier asked gently. "Chimney fire," Bill said, his voice hollow. "Got away from us before we could stop it. Lost everything we have built over 30 years. Martha was crying silently, and Theresa sat beside her, putting an arm around the older woman's shoulders. "You are alive," she said firmly. "That is what matters. Houses can be rebuilt." "With what?" Bill asked bitterly. "We are too old to start over. We do not have the money to rebuild." Xavier was quiet for a moment, then said, "Bill, you remember 2 years ago when my cattle got into your wheat field and caused you a fair bit of damage? You paid for that, Xavier. We are square on that account. You said then that if I ever needed help, you would return the favor. I am calling that in now. You and Martha are coming back to my ranch. You can stay in the house with me until we build you a proper cabin. In exchange, Bill, you can help me with the ranch work. Martha, maybe you and Mrs. Chen can work together on the household management. It would not be charity. It would be a business arrangement. Bill and Martha stared at him, and Theresa felt her heart swell with admiration for this man who offered help so naturally, who understood how to preserve dignity while extending kindness. Xavier, we could not impose like that, Martha began, but Xavier cut her off. It is not an imposition, it is good sense. I have room and I can use the help. You need a place to stay and a way to earn your keep while you figure out your next move. Seems like we can help each other. It took more convincing, but eventually the Hendricks agreed. They loaded what they could salvage into Theresa's wagon, Bill and Martha sitting in the back among their rescued possessions. Xavier rode ahead, while Theresa drove the wagon, making their way slowly back toward Xavier's ranch. It was well after dark when they arrived. Mrs. Chen, alarmed by their soot-covered appearance and the presence of the Hendricks, immediately took charge, heating water for washing and preparing food. While the Hendricks cleaned up and settled in, Xavier and Theresa stood outside by the water trough, washing the worst of the soot from their faces and hands. That was a good thing you did today, Theresa said quietly. Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It was the right thing. They are good people who had bad luck. Anyone would have done the same. No, Theresa said firmly. Not everyone would have. Not everyone would have thought to make it a business arrangement instead of charity. You gave them their dignity along with your help. Xavier looked at her, water dripping from his face, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. My parents died without much, and the charity people gave me after felt like pity. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone, I would do it in a way that did not make them feel small. Theresa reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. You are a good man, Xavier Reeves. They stood there in the darkness, hands clasped, and Theresa realized with sudden clarity that she did not want to leave. Did not want to continue on to her uncle's ranch and the uncertain future waiting there. What she wanted was to stay right here, with this thoughtful, kind, strong man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most. But before she could find the words to say any of that, Mrs. Chen called from the house that food was ready. The moment passed, and they went inside to eat and plan for the days ahead. The next morning, as Theresa prepared to finally continue her journey, Xavier helped her check the wagon one more time, ensuring everything was secure. The Hendricks were settled in the guest room, and plans were already underway to build them a cabin on the far side of Xavier's property. I suppose this is where we say goodbye, Xavier said, standing beside the wagon as Theresa climbed up to the seat. I suppose it is, Theresa said, but the words felt wrong in her mouth. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Theresa saw in his eyes the same longing she felt in her heart. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something about how she felt, but pride and uncertainty held her tongue. Xavier reached up and took her hand. Theresa, before you go, I need to tell you something. These past few days, getting to know you, they have meant more to me than I can properly express. You are smart and brave and determined, and I admire that more than I can say. If circumstances were different, if you were not heading off to start your own life, I would ask if I could court you properly. Theresa's heart was pounding. And if I said I wanted that too, what if I said these past few days have meant just as much to me? Then I would say you still need to go to your uncle's ranch. You need to see what you have inherited, need to make your own decisions about your future without me influencing them. but I would also say that my offer of help stands. If you need me, for any reason, you send word and I will come. And after I have seen the ranch and made my decisions, Xavier's hand tightened on hers. After, if you want, you come back, or I come to you. We figure it out together. It was not a declaration of love or a proposal of marriage, but it was a promise of possibility, and that was enough for now. Theresa leaned down and kissed him, a brief press of lips that held all the words they had not yet said. When she pulled back, she saw the surprise and joy in his eyes. "I will come back," she said firmly. "I do not know when, but I will." "I will be waiting," Xavier said. Theresa snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. She looked back once to see Xavier standing in his yard watching her go, one hand raised in farewell. Then she turned her face west and focused on the journey ahead. The next 4 days of travel passed in a blur of prairie and sky and endless miles. Theresa found her thoughts returning constantly to Xavier, to the sound of his voice and the warmth of his hands, and the way he looked at her like she was someone valuable and worthy. She second-guessed her decision to leave 100 times, but she also knew he had been right. She needed to see this through, needed to know what her uncle had left her and what possibilities it might hold. When she finally arrived at the ranch, following the directions from the lawyer's letter, she found it in better condition than she had dared hope. The buildings were solid and well-maintained, the land showed signs of good management, and the foreman, a weathered man in his 50s named Jack Crawford, seemed honest and competent. "Your uncle was a good man to work for," Jack told her after she had presented her papers and established her ownership. "Fair wages, good conditions. When he died, he made us promise to keep the place running until you arrived, said you would make it official when you got here. We have been doing our best, but we need to know if you are planning to keep us on or sell out." Theresa toured the property, met the 6 hands who worked there, and examined the books that Jack had meticulously maintained. The ranch was profitable, not hugely so, but steady. It represented security and independence, everything she had thought she wanted. But as she sat on the porch of the ranch house that evening, looking out at the sunset, all she could think about was Xavier. About the way he had fixed her wheel without being asked, the way he had ridden beside her to keep her safe, the way he had helped the Hendricks without a second thought. About the connection she had felt with him, the sense that she had finally found someone who understood her. "Mr. Crawford," she said to the foreman when he came to give her the evening report, "if someone wanted to get a message to a ranch near Lincoln, how would they go about that?" Jack considered the question. "We have a hand heading to town tomorrow to pick up supplies. He could carry a letter if you needed." "I do need," Theresa said, making her decision. "I need very much." She spent the evening composing the letter, trying to find the words to express everything she felt. In the end, she kept it simple. "Xavier, I have arrived at my uncle's ranch and found it in good condition. The foreman is honest and the operation is sound. I have the security and independence I sought. But I have realized that security without someone to share it with is just loneliness, and independence without connection is just isolation. I think I knew this from the moment you rode up to my broken wagon, but I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. If your offer still stands, if you still want to figure this out together, I want that too. I am coming back to you. Expect me in 2 weeks. Yours, Theresa." She sealed the letter and gave it to the hand the next morning, then turned her attention to the ranch. She spent the next week learning everything she could about the operation, working alongside the hands to understand the daily routines. She made it clear that she expected honesty and hard work, and that she would pay fair wages in return. When she told Jack Crawford that she would be leaving for a few weeks to handle some personal business, he nodded sagely. A man involved, I am guessing. What makes you say that? That look in your eyes, madam. Seen it before. My wife had that same look when she decided I was worth keeping around. He smiled, the expression crinkling his weathered face. You go handle your personal business. We will keep things running here. Theresa took the wagon, determined to make the journey back to Xavier's ranch in good time. But on the third day, as she was passing through a small settlement called Cedar Creek, she saw a notice posted outside the general store. Doctor needed. No physician within 50 miles. Good pay and housing for qualified candidate. An idea began to form in her mind, crazy and impractical and perfect. She went into the store and found the owner, a talkative woman named Mrs. Peterson, who was happy to provide information. My husband and I started this settlement 5 years ago, Mrs. Peterson explained. We have about 40 families now and more coming all the time, but we desperately need a doctor. The closest physician is in Lincoln, and that is too far when someone is seriously ill or injured. What if I could find you a doctor? Theresa asked. What kind of arrangement would you offer, Mrs.? Peterson's eyes lit up. Free land for a house and clinic, guaranteed salary from the community fund, and all the business they could handle. Why, do you know someone? Theresa thought about her uncle's ranch, about the profit it was generating. I might. Let me make some inquiries. She continued her journey with renewed purpose, her mind spinning with possibilities. When she finally arrived at Xavier's ranch, nearly 2 weeks after she had left, she found him in one of the corrals working with a young horse. He looked up at the sound of her wagon, and the expression that crossed his face, surprise and joy and relief all mixed together, made her heart soar. Xavier vaulted over the corral fence and strode toward her as she climbed down from the wagon. They met in the middle of the yard and for a moment just stood looking at each other. You came back, Xavier said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I said I would, Theresa replied. Then they were in each other's arms, and Xavier was kissing her with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Theresa laughed with pure joy. I have an idea, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. A crazy, complicated idea that might just work. They sat on the porch and Theresa explained. She would sell her uncle's ranch, the land and the cattle and the buildings, to Jack Crawford and the other hands who had been running it. She would give them fair terms, a payment plan they could manage. The money from that sale would go toward buying more land adjacent to Xavier's ranch, expanding his operation. But it would also go toward funding a doctor for Cedar Creek, because Theresa had decided that what she really wanted to do was bring medical care to the frontier. I do not know anything about being a doctor, she said quickly, but I can learn. There are schools back east that train nurses and midwives. I could go for a year, get the training, and come back to establish a clinic in Cedar Creek. It is only 15 miles from here, close enough that we could see each other regularly. And you could expand your ranch, maybe even bring in the Hendricks as full partners in the new land. Xavier listened to all of this, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That is ambitious, he said finally. Too ambitious. No, just ambitious enough for someone like you. He took her hands in his. But Theresa, are you sure? You would be giving up ownership of your own ranch, putting yourself through hard training, all to start something new. That is a lot of risk. I am sure, Theresa said firmly. I have thought about nothing else for days. I do not want to run a cattle ranch in isolation. I want to be part of a community. I want to do work that helps people, and I want to be near you. This plan does all of that. Xavier pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Then we will make it work. Whatever you need, however I can help, we will make it work. Over the next months, Theresa set her plan in motion. She traveled back to her uncle's ranch and made arrangements with Jack Crawford and the Hands to sell them the property. The lawyer in Lincoln helped draw up the papers, establishing fair terms that would allow the men to pay over time. With that money, Theresa bought land adjoining Xavier's ranch and deeded half of it to him as an expansion of his operation. The other half she kept in her own name, establishing her independence even as she built a partnership. Then she traveled to Chicago to attend a nursing college, one of the few that accepted women, and provided practical training in medicine and midwifery. It was hard, being away from Xavier for almost a year, but they wrote letters constantly. Xavier's letters were full of news about the ranch, about the cabin they had built for the Hendricks, and how Bill was proving to be an excellent foreman for the expanded operation. He wrote about missing her, about counting the days until she returned. Theresa's letters talked about her studies, the things she was learning about anatomy and disease and treatment. She wrote about her plans for the clinic in Cedar Creek, about the supplies she would need, and the kinds of cases she expected to handle. And she wrote about loving him, about how every day apart just made her more certain that they belonged together. When Theresa finally returned to Nebraska in the summer of 1879, she found Xavier waiting for her at the train station in Lincoln. He looked leaner, more weathered, but his eyes lit up when he saw her, and the embrace they shared drew smiles from other travelers. "Welcome home," Xavier murmured against her hair. "Home," Theresa repeated, and realized it was true. Nebraska was home now, not because of a place, but because of the man holding her. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Lincoln, with Mrs. Chen and the Hendricks as witnesses. Theresa wore a simple blue dress, and Xavier wore his best suit, and when they exchanged vows, promising to support and cherish each other through whatever the frontier threw at them, Theresa felt a happiness so complete it brought tears to her eyes. They established their routine quickly. Theresa opened her clinic in Cedar Creek, starting with a small building that served as both examination room and pharmacy. Word spread quickly about the new nurse, and soon she was seeing patients regularly, everything from childhood fevers to farm injuries to women needing help with childbirth. Xavier expanded his ranching operation, using the new land to increase his herd and eventually start breeding horses as well as cattle. They built a house on the property line between Xavier's original ranch and Theresa's land, a symbolic location that represented their partnership. It was larger than Xavier's original house, with space for a family and a room set aside where Theresa could see patients in emergencies. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. There was a drought that summer that had Xavier worried about the cattle, and Theresa lost a patient, a young child with pneumonia that haunted her for months. But they faced each challenge together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good. Mrs. Chen became like family, the older woman taking great joy in managing the household and teaching Theresa traditional Chinese remedies that proved surprisingly effective for certain ailments. The Hendricks thrived as well, Bill becoming Xavier's full partner in the ranch, and Martha establishing a vegetable garden that became the envy of the county. In the spring of 1880, Theresa discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified and elated in equal measure, her medical training making her acutely aware of all the things that could go wrong. But Xavier was a rock of support, his calm presence soothing her fears. Their son was born in December of 1880, a healthy baby boy they named Samuel after Xavier's father. Holding him for the first time, watching Xavier's face fill with wonder as he cradled his son, Theresa felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. Being a mother and a nurse proved challenging, but Theresa was nothing if not determined. Mrs. Chen helped care for Samuel when Theresa had patients, and Xavier adjusted his schedule to be home more, taking on some of the ranch work he had previously left to Bill. The years passed in a blur of work and family and community building. Cedar Creek grew from a small settlement to a thriving town, and Theresa's clinic expanded, eventually including a small hospital wing. Xavier's ranch became one of the most successful in the region, his horses particularly sought after for their quality and temperament. They had 3 more children, a daughter named Eleanor born in 1882, twin boys William and Thomas born in 1884. Their house was always full of noise and laughter and the organized chaos that came with a large family. Theresa continued her medical practice, eventually training 2 younger women as nurses to help with the workload. Xavier served on the town council for Cedar Creek, using his practical wisdom to help guide the growing community. When Samuel was 10 years old enough to understand and remember, Theresa told him the story of how she and Xavier had met. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "My wagon wheel shattered on the open prairie," she began, "and I thought I was stranded with no help for miles. But then your father came riding up on his paint horse and he fixed my wheel without being asked. Then he rode beside me to keep me safe, staying with me until sundown and beyond." "He saved you," Samuel said, his young voice awed. "We saved each other," Xavier corrected gently, his arm around Theresa's shoulders. "Your mother taught me that being strong does not mean being alone, that accepting help is not weakness. She showed me that the best kind of strength comes from partnership. And your father showed me that independence does not have to mean isolation," Theresa added. "That I could build my own life and still share it with someone who respects what I want to do." Eleanor, sitting at her mother's feet, asked, "Did you know right away that you loved each other?" Theresa and Xavier looked at each other, sharing a smile full of memories. "Not right away," Theresa said, "but I think part of me knew from the moment he offered to help without expecting anything in return. That kind of genuine kindness is rare, and when you find it, you hold on tight." "I knew when I saw how determined she was to keep helping even when she was exhausted," Xavier said. "When we were fighting that fire at the Hendricks place, she never quit, never complained. That is when I knew she was someone I wanted beside me for life." As the children grew older, they each found their own paths. Samuel developed a passion for ranching and worked alongside Xavier, learning everything his father could teach him. Eleanor showed an aptitude for medicine and went east to study nursing like her mother, eventually returning to expand the clinic into a full hospital. The twins took after their grandfather, developing a talent for working with wood and metal, and they established a wheelwright and blacksmith business in Cedar Creek that became essential to the growing town. Through it all, through the challenges and triumphs, the hard years and the good ones, Theresa and Xavier remained partners in every sense of the word. They consulted each other on major decisions, supported each other's ambitions, and never lost the deep respect and affection that had drawn them together. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, the whole town of Cedar Creek threw them a celebration. The children, now grown with families of their own, organized the event with help from Mrs. Chen, who was elderly now but still sharp as ever. Bill and Martha Hendricks, retired but still living in their cabin on the ranch property, gave a speech about how Xavier and Theresa had shown them that family was not just about blood, but about people who showed up for each other. Standing in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, Theresa leaned against Xavier and marveled at the life they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him quietly. taking the risk on that stubborn woman whose wagon wheel broke. Xavier laughed, the sound warm and familiar after so many years. Not for a single second. Best decision I ever made was to ride beside you that day. You rode beside me until sundown, Theresa said, remembering, and then you just kept riding. And I will keep riding beside you until my last sunset, Xavier said, kissing the top of her head. That is a promise. They danced that night to fiddle music, moving together with the easy grace of people who had spent decades learning each other's rhythms. Theresa looked around at everything they had built, not just the physical structures of ranch and hospital and town, but the community of people who supported each other, the family they had raised, the legacy of kindness and hard work they were leaving behind. The years continued to pass. Xavier eventually turned over the running of the ranch to Samuel, though he still rode out most days to check on the cattle and horses. Theresa trained younger doctors and nurses to take over her practice, though she still saw patients who specifically requested her. They spent more time together, taking long rides across the prairie, visiting their children and grandchildren, simply enjoying the life they had earned. Mrs. Chen passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, and they buried her in the Cedar Creek Cemetery with full honors. Bill Hendricks followed 2 years later, and Martha went less than a month after that, unable to bear being without her partner. Each loss was hard, but also a reminder of the importance of cherishing the time they had. In the summer of 1910, when they were both in their mid-50s, Theresa and Xavier took a trip back to the spot where her wagon wheel had broken all those years ago. The prairie looked much the same, endless grass and sky, though the trail was more worn now, traveled by countless others seeking their fortunes in the West. They stood there in the place where their lives had intersected, where a moment of bad luck had turned into the greatest blessing either of them could have imagined. "Thank you," Theresa said, taking Xavier's hand. "For what? For stopping that day, for helping a stranger, for seeing something in me worth staying for." Xavier squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "Thank you for coming back, for taking a chance on a cowboy who could fix wheels but did not know the first thing about love. You knew enough," Theresa said softly. "You knew that love is about showing up, about doing the work, about staying beside someone even when the trail gets rough." They rode home together as the sun set, side by side as they had been for more than 30 years, as they would be for whatever years remained to them. Behind them, the prairie stretched vast and empty, but ahead was home, was family, was a life rich with purpose and connection and love. When Xavier passed away in 1923 at the age of 68, it was quietly in his sleep with Theresa holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but also felt gratitude for the 44 years they had shared, for every sunrise they had seen together, and every sunset they had weathered side by side. She continued her work at the hospital for several more years, training the next generation of medical professionals, and spent time with her children and the growing number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Theresa lived to the age of 81, passing in 1937 surrounded by family in the house she and Xavier had built together. Her last words were about the day her wagon wheel had shattered, about the cowboy who had fixed it and changed her life, about the journey they had taken together. They buried her beside Xavier in the Cedar Creek Cemetery, under a cottonwood tree much like the ones they had sheltered beneath during that long-ago storm. The headstone read simply, "Theresa Sullivan Reeves, 1856-1937. Beloved wife, mother, healer." She rode beside him until sundown and beyond. The ranch continued under Samuel's management, and eventually his children's. The hospital that had started as Theresa's small clinic became one of the best medical facilities in the region, training doctors and nurses who went on to serve throughout Nebraska and beyond. Cedar Creek grew into a substantial town, and the main street was eventually named Reeves Avenue in honor of Xavier and Theresa's contributions to its founding and growth. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the family they raised and the example they set, showing that true partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, that love was built through daily choices and consistent care, that the best kind of strength came from standing together rather than alone. Years later, when Samuel's own granddaughter asked him about his grandparents, he told her the story the same way it had been told to him. "Grandmother's wagon wheel shattered on the open prairie," he said, "and grandfather fixed it. Then he rode beside her, not just until sundown but for the rest of their lives. That is what love is, riding beside someone through whatever comes, fixing what breaks and staying close when the storms roll in." It was a simple story of a broken wheel and a helpful stranger, of a woman seeking independence and a man offering kindness. But it became something more, a testament to the power of choosing each other every day, of building something lasting through hard work and mutual respect, of finding in each other the partner needed to face the challenges of life on the frontier and beyond. The prairie that had witnessed that first meeting, that vast expanse of grass and sky where Theresa's journey had been interrupted and Xavier's life had been forever changed, remained unchanged by the passage of time. It stood as a silent witness to the countless stories of courage and connection that had played out across its breadth, stories of people who had helped each other, loved each other, built lives together in that wild and beautiful land. And somewhere in the vast record of human experience, in the collective memory of families and communities, the story of Xavier and Theresa endured. Not because they were famous or powerful, but because they exemplified something fundamental and true about what it means to be human, to reach out to another person in their time of need, to recognize connection when it appears, and to have the courage to build a life together despite uncertainty and risk. Their story was simple at its core but profound in its implications. A wagon wheel shattered on the open prairie. A cowboy fixed it and rode beside her until sundown. And from that single act of kindness, from that choice to help and keep helping, to stay and keep staying, came a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that endured for generations. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the cattle raised or the patients healed, not the land acquired or the buildings constructed, but the love shared and the family built, the community strengthened, and the lives touched. Xavier and Theresa had taken their chance encounter on a lonely prairie trail and transformed it into something beautiful and lasting, proving that even in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, kindness could bloom into love, and love could grow into a legacy that time could not erase. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the values they had embodied, the importance of helping others, of keeping promises, of choosing partnership over isolation. The hospital continued to serve the community for decades. The ranch remained productive and well managed, and the family stayed connected across the generations, bound together by the story of how it all began. And on quiet evenings in Cedar Creek, when the sun set over the prairie in brilliant displays of color, the old-timers would sometimes tell the story to newcomers. They would talk about the woman whose wagon wheel broke and the cowboy who stopped to help, about how that simple act of kindness had rippled outward, changing lives and building community and creating something that endured. It was a story about the Wild West, about cowboys and pioneers, and the hard work of building civilization in an untamed land. But more than that, It was a story about human connection, about the profound impact of choosing to help rather than pass by, to stay rather than ride away, to love rather than fear vulnerability. Xavier Reeves and Theresa Sullivan had lived those choices every day of their long marriage, and in doing so, they had created something far more valuable than any fortune or fame. They had created a partnership built on respect and support, a family grounded in love and values, and a community strengthened by their example. That was their true legacy, more enduring than any monument, more valuable than any inheritance. They had shown that the best kind of success was measured not in acres owned or dollars earned, but in lives touched and love shared, in the family raised and the community served. And it had all started with a broken wagon wheel on the open prairie, with a cowboy who chose to stop and help, who fixed what was broken and then stayed, riding beside her through sundown and sunrise, through all the days and years that followed, until their journey together reached its natural and peaceful end. Their graves in Cedar Creek Cemetery became a place where young couples would sometimes visit, drawing inspiration from the story of Xavier and Theresa, hoping their own love might prove as enduring. The house they built still stood, occupied now by great-great-grandchildren who honored the memory of their ancestors while making their own way in the modern world. The prairie where they had first met remained wild and beautiful, a reminder of the frontier that had shaped them and countless others. And in the collective memory of the community they helped build, Xavier and Theresa lived on, not as historical figures but as real people who had faced real challenges and chosen love, partnership, and service to others. That choice, made and remade every day across 44 years of marriage, was their gift to the future, a demonstration that even in the hardest circumstances, even in the wildest and most unforgiving landscapes, human kindness and connection could not just survive but thrive, creating beauty and meaning that would echo across generations. The wagon wheel that had shattered on that long-ago day had been fixed and used for years, eventually retired and preserved as a family heirloom. It hung now in the Cedar Creek Historical Society, accompanied by a placard telling the story of Xavier and Theresa, of how a broken wheel had brought together two people who would go on to help build a community and raise a family that would impact the region for generations. Visitors would read the story and smile, touched by the romance and inspired by the legacy. Some would dismiss it as overly sentimental, but those who knew the real history, who had access to the letters and journals and documented evidence of Xavier and Theresa's lives, knew that the story was true in all the ways that mattered. They had met by chance and stayed by choice. They had faced hardship and celebrated triumph. They had built something lasting not through grand gestures but through daily acts of love and partnership. They had shown that the most profound impact often came not from dramatic moments, but from consistent, faithful presence, from the choice to keep riding beside someone through whatever the trail might bring. And so the story endured, passed down through generations, adapted and retold but always maintaining its essential truth. A wagon wheel shattered. A cowboy fixed it. He rode beside her until sundown, and then he kept riding, kept staying, kept choosing her and their life together day after day, year after year, until the very end. That was the story of Xavier Reeves and Theresa Sullivan, a love story born on the Nebraska prairie in the summer of 1878, a partnership forged through shared values and mutual respect, a legacy built through service and family and unwavering commitment to each other and their community. It was a story of the Wild West, but also a timeless story of human connection, proof that even in the loneliest places, we are capable of finding each other, of building something beautiful together, of creating meaning and purpose through the simple choice to help, to stay, to love. And as the sun set over the prairie each evening, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that Xavier and Theresa had watched together for so many years, their story continued to inspire, to remind all who heard it that the best journeys are the ones we do not take alone, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a moment of crisis, a helping hand, and the courage to keep riding together into whatever lies ahead.